Harold's legs gave out beneath him, and he sank into the dusty wooden chair someone had left in the center of the hidden room. The photographs seemed to pulse in the dim light of his flashlight, each one a small violation of everything he thought he understood about reality. The room itself defied logic. They'd been living in the Victorian mansion for only 3 days, had walked through every inch of it with the realtor twice before closing. Yet here was this space, accessed through a narrow door concealed behind removable shelving in the kitchen pantry, a door that opened onto 15 feet of impossible architecture that shouldn't exist, according to the house's blueprints. He forced himself to stand, to look closer. The wedding dress in the 1963 photograph was identical to the one Margaret had worn when they married. He still remembered the tiny pearl buttons running down her spine, how his fumbling fingers had struggled with them on their wedding night. But the groom's face. Harold pulled out his phone, swiping to a photo from their actual wedding day. The resemblance was perfect, but wrong, like looking at his reflection in a funhouse mirror that somehow made everything appear normal. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Margaret, moving around their bedroom, probably wondering where he'd disappeared to with his late-night cup of tea. She'd been excited about the move, more animated than he'd seen her in years. Finally, she'd said as they'd signed the papers, "We can start our real life." An odd thing to say after 50 years of marriage, but Margaret had always been given to romantic declarations. Harold moved along the wall, studying each photograph with growing dread. The backgrounds changed, different churches, different decades based on the fashion and photography styles, but Margaret remained constant. Not aged exactly, but present in each era as if she'd lived through all of them. Her smile in the 1973 photo showed the same slight asymmetry he'd fallen in love with. The way she tilted her head in 1983 was achingly familiar. But it was the 2013 photograph that made his chest tighten. He remembered that day clearly, their actual 50th wedding anniversary. They'd renewed their vows in a small ceremony at the lighthouse where he'd worked for 30 years. Margaret had worn a cream-colored dress, not the elaborate white gown in the photograph. And Harold had been there, had spoken the words himself, had kissed her as their handful of guests applauded. So, who was the man standing beside her in this version? The most recent photograph drew his attention like a magnet. 1 week ago, Harold examined his own face, or what appeared to be his face, trying to find some flaw, some tell that would reveal it as an elaborate fake. But the laugh lines matched his own, earned through decades of Margaret's terrible jokes. The small mole near his left ear was perfectly placed. Even the way the man held his shoulders, slightly favored to the right from an old lighthouse injury, was identical. A memory surfaced, Margaret's excitement when they'd found this house online 6 months ago. "This is it," she'd said, practically vibrating with certainty. "This is where we need to be." He'd assumed she meant for retirement, for the view of the Atlantic that reminded them both of the lighthouse years. Now he wondered if she'd known about this room all along. The wind outside intensified, and somewhere in the house, a door slammed shut. Harold jumped, his flashlight beam dancing across the photographs. In the shifting light, Margaret's smile seemed to follow him, constant and serene across 60 years of impossible marriages. He thought of all the small inconsistencies he'd dismissed over the years, the way Margaret sometimes referenced places they'd never visited, spoke fondly of people he couldn't remember meeting, her uncanny ability to predict storms days before they hit, even better than the lighthouse instruments. The fact that she never seemed to age quite the way he did, retaining something indefinable that made strangers occasionally mistake her for his daughter rather than his wife. "Harold?" Margaret's voice drifted down from upstairs, tinged with concern. "Everything all right?" He should go to her, should demand answers, should confront her with these impossible images and force an explanation that would restore his sanity. But something held him back. Perhaps the fear that whatever truth lay behind these photographs would be worse than not knowing. Instead, he called back, "Just checking the heating system." "Be up in a minute." "Don't be long," she replied. "It's getting cold." Harold took one last look around the hidden room. In the far corner, barely visible in his flashlight's beam, sat an ornate wooden chest. More secrets, undoubtedly. More impossible truths waiting to destroy what remained of his understanding. But that would have to wait until tomorrow. Tonight, he would go upstairs to the woman he'd loved for 5 decades, would hold her close as the Atlantic storm battered their new home, and he would pretend that everything was exactly as it had always been, even though he now knew with terrible certainty that nothing ever had been. Harold stepped carefully out of the hidden room, his hands trembling as he repositioned the pantry shelves. Each wooden slat seemed to weigh twice what it should, or perhaps the photographs had drained something essential from his muscles. The secret door disappeared seamlessly behind the restored facade, leaving him staring at innocent jars of preserves and canned goods that Margaret had arranged with her usual precision. Everything in its place. Everything normal. Everything a lie. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step a small betrayal of the questions burning in his chest. The house settled around him with unfamiliar groans, still adjusting to their presence after standing empty for 3 years. At the top of the landing, warm light spilled from their bedroom doorway, and he could hear Margaret humming, a tune he'd never heard before, though something about its melody felt ancient, worn smooth by repetition. "There you are," she said, as he appeared in the doorway. She was sitting at the antique vanity they'd moved from their old house, brushing her silver hair with long, practiced strokes. In the mirror's reflection, her eyes found his, and for a moment, Harold felt the familiar flutter in his chest that had never quite faded after all these years. "I was beginning to think you'd gotten lost. Just checking things," he said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth, making sure everything's secure. Margaret set down the brush and turned to face him. Even in her 70s, she moved with an easy grace that he'd always envied. Her nightgown was pale blue, the same shade she'd favored for decades, and her smile carried the warmth that had sustained him through 30 years of lighthouse storms and 20 years of retirement's quieter rhythms. This was what he had to lose, not just her, but the architecture of their shared life, the morning ritual of coffee and crossword puzzles, the way she still reached for his hand during old movies, their Sunday drives along the coast, pointing out changes in familiar landmarks, the comfortable silences that had replaced the need for constant conversation, born from knowing each other's thoughts before they were spoken, or thinking he knew them. "You seem troubled," Margaret said, patting the edge of the bed beside her. "Second thoughts about the move?" Harold sat down, feeling the mattress dip under his weight. Through their bedroom window, he could see the lighthouse beam in the distance, sweeping its eternal arc across the dark water. They'd specifically chosen this house for that view, or rather, Margaret had chosen it, claiming the light would help her sleep better. "No second thoughts," he said carefully. "It's just different. New sounds, new rhythms." "We'll adjust," she said, her hand finding his with unerring accuracy. Her fingers were warm, calloused in familiar places from decades of gardening and homemaking. Real, present, impossible to reconcile with the woman in those photographs. "We always do." Harold studied her profile as she gazed out at the lighthouse. Tomorrow would mark their 4th day in the house. Time to establish the routines that would shape their remaining years. Margaret had already claimed the sunroom for her morning tea, had planned a garden in the sheltered space behind the kitchen. She spoke of joining the local historical society, of volunteering at the Lighthouse Museum, building a life as if the previous 50 years had been merely preparation. "Margaret," he began, then stopped. How could he ask what needed asking? How could he voice suspicions that sounded insane even in his own mind? "Yes? Do you ever feel like—" He searched for words that wouldn't shatter the delicate peace between them. "Like we're meant to be somewhere specific? Like some places call to us?" She turned to study his face, and something flickered in her expression, too quick to interpret, too familiar to ignore. "What a strange question," she said softly. "Though I suppose I've always felt that way about the coast, about lighthouse country, as if I belonged here long before I ever arrived." The wind rattled their windows, and somewhere in the house, that ornate chest waited in its hidden corner. Harold wondered what secrets it held, what other impossible truths might be cataloged in its depths. But tonight, Margaret was beside him, solid and warm and exactly as she'd always been. Tomorrow's mysteries could remain tomorrow's. "I love you," he said, the words carrying 5 decades of accumulated weight. "I know," she replied, her smile softening. "I've always known." She kissed his cheek and settled back against her pillow. Within minutes, her breathing had deepened into sleep's steady rhythm. Harold lay awake much longer, listening to the storm's approach and watching the lighthouse beams sweep across their ceiling in its measured intervals. Somewhere below them, photographs of impossible weddings waited in the dark. But here, in this room, in this moment, Harold Whitmore held his wife close and pretended that love alone could keep the questions at bay. Even though he already knew it couldn't, Harold woke to silence. After 30 years of lighthouse keeping, his internal clock was calibrated to storms. He could sense their approach hours before the first drops fell, could feel the barometric pressure shift in his joints like an old injury. Last night's wind had promised a substantial blow, the kind that would rattle windows and send the Atlantic crashing against the cliffs in spectacular displays of foam and fury. But the morning air hung unnaturally still. He slipped from bed without waking Margaret, whose breathing remained deep and even against her pillow. Pale sunlight filtered through their curtains, revealing a world scrubbed clean and motionless. Harold padded to the window and looked out at an ocean so flat it resembled polished glass, reflecting the sky with perfect clarity. In the distance, the lighthouse stood like a white sentinel against the blue, its beacon dark in the morning calm. Impossible. He'd tracked storms across these waters for 3 decades. They didn't simply vanish overnight. Downstairs, Harold started the coffee with hands that shook slightly from more than morning stiffness. The normalcy of the routine, measuring grounds, filling the reservoir, waiting for the first promising gurgles, felt like armor against the questions multiplying in his mind. He would drink his coffee, read the paper when it arrived, and perhaps this strange calm was simply nature's way of welcoming them to their new home. The doorbell's chime shattered that fragile hope. Harold glanced at the kitchen clock, 7:23 a.m. Too early for deliveries, too early for neighborly visits. He approached the front door cautiously, peering through the sidelight window at a figure that made his chest tighten with recognition and confusion. The man on his doorstep was Harold Whitmore. Not similar, not reminiscent, identical in every detail that mattered, the same weathered hands, the same slightly stooped posture from years of climbing lighthouse stairs, the same pattern of lines around gray eyes that had spent decades squinting into salt spray and sun. But this version wore clothes Harold didn't recognize. A navy peacoat that looked expensive, pressed slacks instead of Harold's preferred worn jeans, leather shoes polished to an unnatural shine. The other Harold smiled and knocked again, a confident rap that Harold himself would never have used. His own knocks were tentative things, apologetic for the disturbance. "Margaret?" the man called, his voice carrying Harold's own timbre, but with different inflections, different certainties. "I know you're in there, darling. We had plans, remember?" Harold's hand froze on the door handle. Through the kitchen doorway, he could hear Margaret moving about upstairs. The familiar sounds of her morning routine, the soft footfalls that had provided the rhythm to 50 years of shared dawns. She would be down soon, expecting her tea and the quiet companionship that had sustained them through retirement's gentler demands. The stranger wearing his face knocked again, more insistently. "Don't make this difficult," the other Harold said, his tone carrying an edge of impatience. "The lighthouse keeper told us yesterday was the transition day. I've been waiting all night for my turn." "Turn for what?" Harold pressed himself against the doorframe, his mind racing through possibilities that all led to the same impossible conclusion. The photographs weren't forgeries or coincidences or products of his fragmenting sanity. They were documentation, records of something that had been happening for 60 years, something Margaret had been part of all along. "Harold?" Margaret's voice drifted down from upstairs, bright with morning cheer. "Was that the door? Are we expecting someone?" The choice crystallized before him with terrible clarity. He could pretend he hadn't heard, could slip back upstairs and wake Margaret, could demand explanations for things that defied explanation. Or he could open the door and confront whatever truth waited on the other side, a truth that might destroy everything he thought he understood about his life, his marriage, his very identity. Footsteps on the stairs, Margaret coming down to investigate. her morning routine disrupted by unexpected visitors. In moments, she would see him standing frozen by the door, would perhaps understand that he'd discovered the hidden room, the photographs, the impossibilities that surrounded them like a net drawing tight. The other herald knocked one final time, and his voice carried the weight of authority when he spoke. "Margaret, please. We both know how this works. 50 years is the limit. It always has been. Now it's my turn to love you." Harold's hand moved to the deadbolt, his fingers tracing the cool metal as he faced the most important decision of his life. Behind him, Margaret's footsteps paused on the landing. Ahead of him, a stranger with his own face waited with the patience of someone who had done this before. The morning silence pressed against the windows like a held breath, and Harold Whitmore realized that whatever came next would change everything forever. He turned the lock. The deadbolt clicked open with a sound like breaking bones. Harold's hand remained frozen on the mechanism as the full weight of his action crashed over him. He had opened the door, but he hadn't turned the handle, hadn't pulled it wide, hadn't invited the impossible into his home. The lock was simply undone, a gesture toward truth without fully embracing it. Through the narrow gap between door and frame, he could see a slice of the other herald's face. The same crow's feet, the same small scar above the left eyebrow from a childhood fall he'd never told Margaret about. Even the way this stranger breathed seemed familiar, the slight wheeze that had developed after years of salt air and physical labor. "Thank you," the other herald said softly. His voice held gratitude tinged with something else, relief, perhaps, or resignation. "I know this isn't easy." "I haven't opened the door," Harold whispered, his words barely audible even to himself. "The lock is undone, but I haven't opened it." A pause. Then, incredibly, a sound Harold recognized as his own laugh, but warmer, more confident than any laugh that had ever passed his lips. "Semantics, my friend, but I understand. The first time is always the hardest. The first time." As if this were a ritual, a ceremony Harold should have been prepared for. As if 50 years of marriage had been leading inexorably to this moment when he would step aside for another version of himself. "Harold?" Margaret's footsteps resumed their descent, closer now. "Is everything all right down there?" He could hear the concern threading through her voice, the gentle worry of a wife who knew her husband's moods better than he knew them himself. Except, did she? Had any of her knowledge been real, or had she simply been playing a role she'd perfected across decades of practice with other heralds, other 50-year cycles of manufactured intimacy? The questions were acid in his throat. Harold pressed his forehead against the cool wood of the door, feeling the house settle around him like a living thing. This Victorian mansion with its hidden rooms and impossible architecture, Margaret had chosen it, had insisted upon it, had claimed to love it from the first online photograph. Because she'd been here before? Because she knew what it contained, what it was designed to facilitate? "I can't," Harold said, his voice breaking. "I can't do this." "You can," the other herald replied with devastating gentleness. "Because you love her. Because 50 years of loving her has to mean something, even if it means letting go." Through the gap in the door, Harold caught a glimpse of movement, the other man's hand reaching toward the handle. Those fingers were identical to his own, down to the calluses and scars and the simple gold band that had never left his ring finger in 5 decades. But they moved with a certainty Harold had never possessed. As if this stranger had been born knowing exactly who he was and what he wanted. "What happens to me?" Harold whispered. Silence. Then footsteps on the stairs stopped entirely. Margaret had paused, perhaps sensing the gravity of whatever conversation was taking place at her front door. When the other herald spoke again, his voice carried a weight of knowledge that Harold both craved and feared. "I don't know," he admitted. "I only know what happened to the herald before me. He faded. Slowly at first, then more quickly as I settled into his life, into their life. His memories became mine, his love for her became mine. But he just wasn't needed anymore." Harold's knees nearly buckled. 50 years of existence, 50 years of accumulated experience and love and quiet joy, destined to simply dissolve so that another man could take his place. Even if that man was somehow him, somehow another version of the same soul, it would still be death. Still be the end of Harold Whitmore as he understood himself to be. "But that's not what you want to hear," the other herald continued, his voice infinitely patient. "You want to know if you'll cease to exist, if the man you've been will simply disappear. And honestly, friend, I can't answer that. Memory is strange here. Time is strange here. Perhaps you'll find peace in whatever comes next." Margaret's footsteps resumed, lighter now, as if she'd decided the conversation was nothing to worry about, as if she trusted Harold to handle whatever waited on the other side of the door. The faith in that simple sound, her absolute confidence in his judgment, made Harold's chest ache with loss that hadn't even happened yet. 50 years, he said, tasting the words like ashes. 50 wonderful years, the other herald agreed. Don't let their ending diminish what they were. Harold's hand trembled on the door handle. Behind him, Margaret had reached the bottom of the stairs, her humming drifting through the morning air like a blessing. Ahead of him, a stranger with his face waited to claim the only life Harold had ever wanted. And still, he couldn't bring himself to open the door. Harold's breath came in shallow gasps as he stood suspended between two impossible choices. His fingers ached where they gripped the door handle, knuckles white with the force of his indecision. Behind him, Margaret's humming grew closer, that strange, ancient melody that seemed to carry the weight of decades he'd never lived. The other herald waited with infinite patience, and in that patience, Harold recognized something terrible. This man had done this before, had stood on other doorsteps, had convinced other versions of himself to step aside. The confidence in his voice wasn't arrogance, it was experience. "Margaret, love," the other herald called through the gap. "I brought those photographs you wanted to see, the ones from the Lighthouse Museum archives." Harold's blood turned to ice. The photographs. This stranger knew about the hidden room, knew about the impossible wedding portraits. Of course he did. He was part of them, part of whatever cycle had been repeating itself in this house for 60 years. "Oh, wonderful." Margaret's voice brightened, and Harold heard her quicken her pace down the hallway. "Harold, let him in. You remember, I told you yesterday about the local historian who was going to help us research the house's previous owners." No, she had never mentioned any historian. Harold would have remembered that conversation, would have asked a dozen questions about the house's history, unless his mind reeled, unless his memories were already becoming unreliable, unless the transition had already begun. The other herald's voice dropped to a whisper meant only for Harold's ears. "She's protecting you, making this easier by giving you a story to believe. She's done this 6 times before. She knows how to be kind about it." 6 times. 6 previous heralds, each believing in 50 years of unique love, each discovering too late that he was just another iteration in an endless cycle. Harold thought of the photographs again, the dates spanning back to 1963. Margaret, always young and beautiful and radiant. The groom's aging and changing, but somehow always fundamentally the same man. "I can't," Harold whispered, but his hand was already turning the handle. "You already have," the other herald said gently. The door swung open. Harold found himself face to face with his own reflection, but perfected somehow. This version stood straighter, smiled more easily, wore his age like a comfortable coat instead of a burden. The other herald's eyes held depths of experience that seemed impossible, as if he had lived not just 50 years but centuries. "Hello, friend," the other herald said, extending his hand. "Thank you." Harold stared at the offered handshake, but couldn't bring himself to accept it. To touch this man would make it real, would acknowledge that he was willingly stepping aside for his own replacement. Instead, he stepped backward, allowing the other herald to cross the threshold into what had been his home. The moment the other man's foot touched the hardwood floor, Harold felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening, as if invisible threads that had anchored him to this place, this life, were beginning to fray. The sensation was nauseating and oddly liberating at once. "Harold?" Margaret appeared in the hallway, and her face lit up with genuine joy at the sight of the stranger. "How lovely to see you again. Did you bring those documents we discussed?" Again. She had met this man before, recently enough to discuss documents and make plans. While Harold slept, while he thought they were beginning a new chapter of their lives together, Margaret had been preparing for his replacement. The other Harold moved past him with easy familiarity, already knowing where the kitchen was, where Margaret preferred to conduct important conversations. "I brought everything," he said, his voice carrying the warmth that Harold had always wished he could summon more easily. "The house has quite a fascinating history. You'll be amazed at what I've uncovered." Harold remained frozen by the open door, watching his wife, smile at another man with the intimacy of long acquaintance. The morning air flowing through the doorway felt like a physical force pushing him backward, encouraging him to leave, to let the transition complete itself without further resistance. "Harold, close the door," Margaret called without looking back. "You're letting in the cold." But which Harold was she addressing? The question hung in the air like smoke, and Harold realized with crystalline clarity that it no longer mattered. The other man was already moving toward the kitchen, already claiming the space with subtle confidence, already becoming the Harold who belonged here. Harold's hand fell away from the door handle. The morning silence pressed against his back like a tide, and he understood that crossing this threshold hadn't it been about opening the door. It had been about recognizing that he no longer belonged on this side of it. He turned toward the impossible stillness of the morning, and took his first step into whatever waited beyond the life he had known. Harold's foot touched the stone pathway outside his former home, and the world shifted around him like water finding new channels. The Victorian mansion behind him seemed to shimmer and settle, as if it were exhaling with relief now that the proper Harold was inside where he belonged. Each step away from the door felt like walking through increasingly thick air, reality growing strange and malleable around the edges. The impossible stillness of the morning made more sense now. This wasn't weather. This was transition, the world holding its breath while one version of Harold Whitmore dissolved and another took his place. But where could he go? Harold paused at the end of the walkway, looking back at the house that had been his for exactly 3 days. Through the kitchen window, he could see movement, Margaret gesturing animatedly while the other Harold nodded with familiar understanding. They were already deep in conversation about the photographs, about the house's history, about secrets Harold had never been trusted to share. A voice behind him said, "It's disorienting, isn't it? The first few hours." Harold spun around to find an elderly man sitting on the stone wall that bordered the neighboring property. The stranger wore a thick fisherman's sweater and had the weathered hands of someone who'd spent his life working outdoors. His face was deeply lined but kind, and his eyes held a recognition that made Harold's skin crawl with familiarity. "Do I know you?" Harold asked, though something deep in his chest already suspected the answer. The man smiled sadly. "I'm Tom Morrison, or I was anyway. 43 years with my Sarah before I found myself standing exactly where you are now, watching another man slide into my life like he'd always belonged there." Harold stared at the stranger's face, looking for traces of the man in the photographs. The third groom from the left, dated 1982, but this man looked far older than the decade that had passed since that impossible wedding. "That's not possible," Harold whispered. "Time moves differently for us," Tom said, patting the stone wall beside him in invitation. "Once you're outside the cycle, you age in strange ways. Sometimes fast, sometimes slow. I think it depends on how much fight you have left in you." Harold found himself moving toward the wall despite every instinct screaming at him to run. But run where? This conversation might be insane, but it was the first thing that had made any sense since he'd discovered the hidden room. "How many of us are there?" Harold asked as he settled onto the cold stone. "Here in Beacon's End? 4. Counting you now. Harold, Tom, Benjamin, and Charles. The others, well, some find peace eventually. Some just fade away entirely when they can't accept what's happened to them." Tom gestured toward the town below, where Harold could see other figures moving through the morning with purpose that seemed somehow disconnected from the normal flow of life. An older man feeding seagulls at the harbor moved with the mechanical precision of someone performing a ritual rather than enjoying a moment. Another figure sat motionless on a bench overlooking the water, as still as a statue. "What is this place?" Harold asked. "A kind of way station," Tom replied. Margaret isn't the only one, you understand. There are others like her scattered throughout these coastal towns, women who exist outside normal time, who collect husbands the way some people collect stamps. They love genuinely, I believe that completely. But their love operates by different rules than ours. Harold thought of the lighthouse keeper who'd sold them the house, his strange certainty about transition days, and his knowledge of things he shouldn't have known. How long has this been happening? Longer than you'd believe. The town records go back to the 1800s, but I suspect it's been much longer than that. These coastal communities have always attracted women like Margaret. Something about the tides, the constant change and renewal. They draw power from it somehow. A seagull landed on the wall between them, cocking its head to study Harold with one bright eye. The bird's attention felt oddly weighted, as if it were evaluating him for some purpose he couldn't understand. "Why 50 years?" Harold asked. Tom's expression grew thoughtful. "I think it's about love itself. 50 years is long enough to build a complete life together, to experience every season of marriage from passion through companionship to the deep contentment of old age. Any longer, and the love begins to calcify, becomes routine instead of choice. Margaret needs love that stays fresh, that remembers why it chose her in the first place. So we just, what? Wander around this town forever? Watch our replacements live our lives?" "Some do." Tom stood, brushing stone dust from his sweater. "Others find different paths. There's a community of us, Harold. Men who've loved impossible women and survived to tell about it. We help newcomers understand the rules of this new existence. We teach them how to find purpose when the purpose you've known for 50 years belongs to someone else now." Harold looked back at his house one more time. Through the window, Margaret was laughing at something the other Harold had said, her face bright with the joy Harold had always struggled to kindle in her. "Will you show me?" Harold asked. Tom smiled, and for the first time since Harold had opened that terrible door, he felt something that might eventually become hope. Tom led Harold down the winding coastal path toward the heart of Beacon's End, their footsteps muffled by the strange atmospheric pressure that made everything feel suspended in amber. As they walked, Harold noticed details that had escaped him during his brief time as a normal resident, the way certain houses seemed to shimmer slightly at their edges, as if they existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, the way some townspeople moved with purpose while others drifted like ghosts through their daily routines. "There," Tom said, pointing to a weathered building near the harbor that Harold had assumed was abandoned. "The Anchor's Rest. It's not on any tourist maps, but it's been serving our kind for longer than anyone remembers." The tavern's windows glowed with warm yellow light despite the early hour, and Harold could see figures moving inside, men of various ages, all carrying themselves with the particular exhaustion of those who had lost everything they thought defined them. The building itself seemed to exist in a pocket of older time, its architecture more colonial than Victorian, its foundation stones green with centuries of salt spray. "Are we dead?" Harold asked suddenly, the question emerging from a fear he hadn't dared voice. Tom considered this carefully. "I don't think so. We eat, we sleep, we feel pain and joy and grief, but we're no longer part of the world's forward motion. We exist in the spaces between what was and what could be." A younger man emerged from the tavern, perhaps 40 years old, with dark hair and the lean build of someone who'd spent his life at sea. He approached them with the easy confidence of someone greeting old friends, though Harold had never seen him before. "Tom," the stranger said, clasping the older man's shoulder. "I see we have a new arrival." "Harold Whitmore," Tom said by way of introduction. 50 years with Margaret Whitmore, lighthouse keeper before this. "Harold, meet Benjamin Reed. 37 years with Isabella before she renewed herself with a younger version." Benjamin's handshake was firm, his eyes kind but shadowed with understanding that Harold found both comforting and terrifying. "Isabella specializes in passionate young love," Benjamin explained. "She resets every 20 years or so, always finds herself a man in his 20s who can worship her with the intensity of first love. I was her 4th iteration. 4th that you know of," Tom corrected gently. The casual way they discussed these impossible relationships made Harold's head spin. These men spoke of their wives' supernatural nature as if it were simply an unusual hobby, a quirk to be accommodated rather than a horror to be fled from. "How do you bear it?" Harold asked. "Knowing that everything you thought was real, Benjamin interrupted firmly. "That's the first lesson, Harold. The love was real. The years together, the intimacy, the shared life, all of it happened exactly as you remember. These women don't traffic in illusions. They give us genuine love, complete and total, for as long as the cycle allows. But then they discard us like broken toys." Tom shook his head. "No, they transform us, give us a different kind of existence." "We're not discarded, Harold. We're evolved." They had reached the tavern's entrance, and Harold could hear voices inside, low conversations punctuated by occasional laughter. Men sharing stories, offering advice, building the kind of community that Harold had never known he needed. The sound drew him forward despite his resistance to accepting this new reality. "What's in there?" he asked. "Preparation," Tom said simply. "Tonight, Margaret will realize you're truly gone. She'll grieve, genuinely and deeply, for the Harold she loved. That grief is part of the cycle, necessary for her to fully bond with your replacement. But she may also come looking for you, to say goodbye properly. You need to be ready for that conversation." The thought of facing Margaret again made Harold's chest tighten with panic. How could he look into her eyes knowing what he now knew? How could he pretend to understand or forgive what she had done to him? To all of them. "Will she tell me the truth?" Harold asked. Benjamin and Tom exchanged a look heavy with shared experience. "She'll tell you what she believes you need to hear," Benjamin said carefully. "These women exist by their own moral code. They don't see themselves as predators or deceivers. In Margaret's mind, she gave you 50 years of perfect love, more than most people ever receive. The fact that it had to end doesn't diminish its value." "But I have a choice," Harold said, surprising himself with the steel in his voice, "about how to respond when she comes." Tom smiled, and Harold caught a glimpse of the man he must have been before his own transformation. Strong-willed, uncompromising when it mattered. "Now you're beginning to understand. Come inside, Harold. Let us teach you how to love an impossible woman on your own terms." The tavern door swung open, revealing warmth and fellowship, and the promise of answers Harold wasn't sure he was ready to hear. Harold crossed the threshold of the Anchor's Rest, and immediately understood that everything Benjamin and Tom had told him was merely preparation for a test far more challenging than he could have imagined. The tavern's interior defied the laws of physics. What had appeared to be a modest building from outside opened into a vast space filled with dozens of men of all ages, their conversations creating a low hum that seemed to resonate in Harold's bones. But it was the walls that made Harold's breath catch in his throat. Every available surface was covered with photographs, not unlike the wedding pictures he'd discovered in the hidden room, but these showed the aftermath. Men standing alone on cliffs, in empty houses, beside hospital beds, where beautiful women lay unconscious or worse. Each photograph was labeled with dates and names. Thomas Morrison, final day with Sarah, October 15, 1982. Benjamin Reed, Isabella's last sleep, June 3, 1987. Charles Whitman, Catherine's departure, December 21, 1973. "Dear God," Harold whispered, studying the images. In every photograph, the abandoned men wore expressions of devastating loss mixed with something else, a terrible understanding that their grief was just another spoke in an endless wheel. "The final test," said a new voice behind him. Harold turned to see an elderly man with snow-white hair and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of decades. "I'm Charles Whitman, no relation, though the name similarity isn't coincidental. The women choose us based on patterns we don't fully understand." Charles gestured toward a particular photograph that made Harold's blood freeze. It showed a man who could have been Harold's twin, standing in what appeared to be the same Victorian mansion Harold had just left, holding a wedding photograph in trembling hands. The date read, Harold Morrison, Margaret's previous cycle, September 14, 2013. "That's impossible," Harold breathed. "I'm Harold Morrison. That's my maiden name, Margaret kept Whitmore from her first marriage. No, Charles said gently. Margaret has always been Margaret Whitmore. You've always been Harold Morrison. The details of your histories change to fit the cycle, but the essential elements remain constant. You were a lighthouse keeper because Harold Morrison was always meant to be a lighthouse keeper. The room seemed to tilt around Harold as the implications crashed over him. Not only was his marriage a repetition, but his entire identity had been constructed to fit Margaret's pattern. His memories of childhood, his career choice, even his personality, how much of Harold Morrison had ever been real? "This is your ordeal," Benjamin said, moving to Harold's side. "Every man who enters this place faces the same moment of understanding. You can choose to believe you were a real person who loved a supernatural woman, or you can accept that you were created by forces beyond your understanding to fulfill a specific role. Both versions lead to madness if you're not careful." "But there's a third choice," Tom added, appearing at Harold's other side. "You can decide that it doesn't matter, that the love you experienced was genuine regardless of how it came to be, that the man you became over 50 years of marriage was real, even if the man you started as was artificial." Harold stared at the photograph of his predecessor, studying the face that was so nearly identical to his own. What happened to him? To the other Harold? "He chose to forget," Charles said sadly. "Couldn't bear the weight of understanding what he was. Margaret granted him that mercy, erased his awareness and let him spend his remaining years believing he was simply a widower living in a seaside town. He died peacefully 5 years ago, having convinced himself that his wife had passed naturally after a long illness. And that's an option for me?" "It is," Tom confirmed. "Margaret will offer it when she comes for you tonight. The chance to forget everything you've learned, to remember only the love and lose the knowledge of what lies beneath it. Many men choose that path." Harold moved deeper into the tavern, past groups of men playing chess and cards, past others reading books that seemed to shimmer and change their contents as he watched. At the far end of the room, he discovered another collection of photographs, these showing the same men from the Wall of Departures, but transformed. They gardened in impossible landscapes, built structures that defied geometry, composed music that seemed to generate its own light. "Or you can choose transformation," a voice said behind him. Harold turned to find a man who appeared to be in his 30s, though his eyes held the depth of centuries. "I'm James Whitmore, Margaret's first husband in this current cycle, from 1963. I've been learning what it means to love someone who exists outside time itself. You've been here for 60 years? Time moves differently once you accept what you are," James explained. "I've aged perhaps a decade and 6. I've learned to paint with colors that don't exist in the normal spectrum. I've written symphonies that can only be heard by men like us. I've discovered that losing a mortal life can be the beginning of an immortal one." The tavern door opened behind them, letting in a gust of evening air that shouldn't have been possible, given that Harold had entered during morning. Margaret stepped into the light, her face showing the ravages of genuine grief, her eyes searching until they found Harold across the crowded room. "Hello, my love," she said, her voice carrying clearly despite the impossible distance between them. "It's time for us to say goodbye properly." Every conversation in the tavern stopped. Harold felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon him, men who had faced this same moment, this same choice, this same test of everything they thought they understood about love and loss and the price of both. Margaret began walking toward him, and Harold realized that his true ordeal was just beginning. Margaret moved through the tavern with impossible grace, her feet seeming to barely touch the weathered floorboards. As she approached, Harold noticed details that 50 years of marriage had somehow obscured, the way shadows bent around her as if drawn by some magnetic force, how the very air seemed to thicken with each step she took toward him. The other men in the tavern watched with a mixture of sympathy and fascination, witnesses to a ritual they had all endured. "You found them," Margaret said when she reached him, her voice carrying genuine sadness. "I hoped you might choose the simple path, accept the gift of forgetting, live out your remaining years in peace. But you were always too curious, too determined to understand the mechanisms behind every lighthouse, every storm." 50 years, Harold said. surprised by how steady his voice sounded. 50 years of what I thought was my life, and you let me believe it was real. It was real. Margaret's eyes blazed with sudden intensity. Every morning you brought me coffee in that chipped blue mug, every storm we weathered together, every quiet evening reading by the fire, all of it happened exactly as you remember. The love between us exists outside the constraints of linear time, Harold. It doesn't become false simply because it was also inevitable. Harold looked around the tavern at the men who had preceded him, each face showing the scars of this same conversation. But I'm not the first Harold Morrison you've loved. I'm not even the second. No, Margaret admitted, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked fragile. You're the seventh, each one different, each one precious, each one teaching me something new about what it means to love a mortal man. The Harold who loved storms taught me patience. The Harold who feared them taught me courage. You, her voice caught slightly, you taught me what it means to choose love every single day, even when the magic fades into routine. Then why? Harold's composure finally cracked, 50 years of devotion curdling into something harder. If you loved each of us, if we were all precious, why the deception? Why not tell us what you were from the beginning? Margaret reached toward him, then let her hand fall when he stepped back. Because knowing would have poisoned every moment. You would have spent our entire marriage wondering which feelings were yours and which were manufactured to fit my needs. You would have analyzed every kiss, questioned every shared laugh, measured our intimacy against some impossible standard of authenticity. So you chose our ignorance over our consent. The words landed like a physical blow. Margaret's face went white, and Harold felt a savage satisfaction that immediately curdled into self-loathing. Around them, the tavern's atmosphere grew heavier, more oppressive, as if the building itself was responding to the pain radiating from its supernatural visitor. I chose to give you the gift of unquestioned love, Margaret said quietly. 50 years without doubt, without the fear that your partner might leave, without the constant negotiations that plague normal marriages. I gave you certainty in an uncertain world. You stole my agency. Harold's voice grew stronger, fed by a rage he hadn't known he possessed. My right to choose who I loved and how I loved them. My right to decide whether a supernatural existence was worth the price of my humanity. And what would you have chosen? Margaret's composure finally cracked, revealing something desperate underneath. If I had appeared to you as a young man and explained what I was, what I offered, 50 years of perfect love followed by transformation into something beyond mortal understanding, would you have said yes? Harold opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. The honest answer terrified him more than Margaret's deception ever could. At 23, faced with the choice between an uncertain normal life and guaranteed love with an impossible woman, what would Harold Morrison have decided? You would have said yes, Margaret continued, reading his silence correctly. Just like James did, just like all the others when they were finally offered the choice. But you would have spent 50 years wondering if your love was real or simply the result of supernatural manipulation. You would have died a little bit every day, questioning every emotion, doubting every moment of happiness. That should have been my decision to make. Yes, Margaret said simply, and the admission hit Harold like a physical blow. It should have been. I was young when this cycle began, Harold. Young and afraid of being alone for the eternity I knew stretched ahead of me. I made choices born from selfishness and fear, and I've perpetuated them for so long that I've forgotten how to love any other way. She looked around the tavern at the men who had loved her across the decades. But I'm tired now. Tired of the deception, tired of the guilt, tired of watching good men grapple with revelations that shatter everything they thought they knew about themselves. This is why I've come, not just to say goodbye, but to offer you something I've never offered before. Harold felt the weight of every gaze in the tavern, the collective breath-holding of men who had never been offered whatever Margaret was about to propose. I want to give you the truth, Margaret said, all of it, and then let you choose your own ending. Harold's heart hammered against his ribs as Margaret's words settled over the tavern like a shroud. Around them, the assembled men leaned forward with an intensity that bordered on desperate hunger. James Whitmore's face had gone pale, his centuries-old composure finally cracking. Tom gripped the back of a wooden chair so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Even Benjamin, who had seemed so accepting of his fate, stared at Margaret with naked longing. "The truth," Harold repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "What truth could possibly be worse than what I already knew?" Margaret closed her eyes, and when she opened them, Harold saw something that made his blood freeze. Fear. Not the melancholy sadness he'd grown accustomed to, not even the guilt she'd carried throughout their confrontation, but genuine bone-deep terror. "The truth about what I am," she said. "What we are. What this place really is." She gestured around the tavern, and suddenly Harold's perception shifted like a camera lens coming into focus. The warm wooden walls flickered, revealing stone underneath, ancient, weathered blocks that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. The comfortable chairs and tables wavered, showing glimpses of something else beneath, an endless library with shelves that stretched impossibly high, filled with books that wrote themselves, their pages turning without wind or human hands. "We're not in Maine anymore," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger as the illusion fell away completely. "We haven't been since you walked through that tavern door. This is the archive, a place that exists between worlds, where stories are born and return to die." Harold staggered backward, his mind reeling as the full scope of his situation became clear. The men around him, dozens of faces he'd assumed were fellow victims, began to shimmer and change. Some remained solid, their presence warm and real, but others faded to translucency, revealing themselves as echoes, memories, fragments of stories that had played out across centuries. "I'm not a supernatural woman who falls in love with mortal men," Margaret said, each word falling like a stone into still water. "I'm a story, capital S, one of the fundamental narratives that shape human understanding of love and loss, the eternal wife, the beautiful mystery, the woman who loves and leaves." She turned to address the assembled men, her voice carrying new authority. "And all of you, every Harold, every James, every Tom and Benjamin and Charles, you're not men who were transformed by love. You're characters. Iterations of the devoted husband story, playing out the same essential arc across different time periods, different settings, different details, but always the same emotional core." Harold felt reality tilting beneath his feet. "The lighthouse, our marriage, 50 years of performing a role you were created to perform," Margaret interrupted, not unkindly. "But Harold, listen to me carefully. That doesn't make it false. Stories are the most real things in existence. They shape civilizations, topple governments, inspire love, justify wars. Every human who has ever lived has found meaning through narrative. We are the source code of meaning itself." Around them, the archive revealed its true nature. Books materialized and dissolved in endless cycles, their pages containing every love story ever told or imagined. Harold caught glimpses of familiar tales, Romeo and Juliet, Orpheus and Eurydice, countless others, but also stories he'd never heard, stories that wouldn't be written for centuries, stories that existed only as possibilities waiting for the right moment to manifest in human consciousness. "This is why the men here seem so content," Margaret continued. "Why they've adapted to their transformation instead of raging against it. Deep down, they understand what they are. Eternal archetypes given temporary flesh, playing out the roles that give human existence its emotional structure." James Whitmore stepped forward, his face showing wonder instead of the devastation Harold expected. "That's why I could paint with impossible colors, why time moved differently. I wasn't becoming something inhuman. I was remembering what I'd always been." "But the choice you mentioned," Harold said, his voice cracking with desperation. "You said you'd let me choose my own ending." Margaret nodded, her expression growing solemn. "For the first time in my existence, I'm offering a story the chance to break its own cycle, to stop being the devoted husband and become something else. Something unprecedented. I don't know what that would mean for either of us, or for the fundamental architecture of human narrative itself." She extended her hand toward Harold, not in supplication but in invitation. "You can choose to remain Harold Morrison, eternal iteration of devoted love, and return to the cycle knowing what you are. Conscious mythology, aware archetype. You can choose to forget, as your predecessor did, and live out one final human lifetime in blessed ignorance. Her eyes locked onto his, and Harold saw infinity spinning behind them. Every love story that had ever been or ever could be, all of them somehow dependent on his decision. Or, Margaret whispered, you can help me discover what happens when two fundamental stories decide to write themselves a completely new ending. The choice hung before Harold like a blade, sharp enough to cut reality itself. Harold stared at Margaret's outstretched hand for a long moment, his mind reeling between terror and possibility. Around them, the archive hummed with anticipation, thousands of stories holding their breath, as if the fundamental nature of narrative itself hung in the balance. The weight of the choice should have crushed him. It was too vast, too consequential for any single consciousness to bear. But as he stood there, surrounded by echoes of himself across centuries, Harold felt something unexpected bloom in his chest. Not despair or rage or the existential vertigo he'd been drowning in since discovering the hidden photographs. Instead, a strange, fierce joy began to burn through his confusion. All those years, he said slowly, his voice growing stronger with each word, I thought I was afraid of losing you, but what I was really afraid of was discovering that our love wasn't special, that it was ordinary, replaceable, forgettable. Margaret's extended hand trembled slightly. Harold. But this, he continued, gesturing around the impossible archive with its self-writing books and eternal stories, this is the opposite of ordinary. Our love is so fundamental to human understanding that it exists as living mythology. We're not just two people who fell in love, we're the template for what love means. James Whitmore moved closer, his centuries-old eyes bright with recognition. You're beginning to understand. I'm beginning to choose, Harold corrected. He looked at the assembled men, some solid, some ethereal, all of them iterations of the same eternal story. For the first time since entering the tavern, he felt kinship rather than horror. You've all been waiting for this, haven't you? Not just watching my ordeal, but hoping I'd find the courage you couldn't. Tom stepped forward, his face showing naked longing. In all the cycles I've witnessed, no one has ever been offered the chance to break free, to become something new. Because no one ever asked, Harold realized, turning back to Margaret. You kept offering the same three choices, forget, accept, or transform within the existing parameters, because that's all anyone ever demanded. But what if we demanded more? Margaret's composure finally cracked completely, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. I don't know what more looks like, Harold. I've been the eternal wife for so long that I can't imagine existing as anything else. What if we destroy ourselves in the attempt? What if we unravel something essential to human understanding of love itself? Then we'll have died trying to grow beyond our limitations instead of living forever trapped by them. The words surprised Harold as much as anyone else. After 73 years of being careful, of maintaining lighthouse equipment and following protocols and choosing safety over adventure, he was proposing to leap into an unknown that could unmake the fundamental architecture of story itself. But the terror of that possibility felt clean compared to the suffocating certainty of eternal repetition. Besides, Harold continued, reaching toward Margaret's still extended hand, we won't be alone in this. Will we, James? The painter's face blazed with sudden understanding. You're asking us to come with you, to break our own cycles. I'm asking if you want to discover what we might become if we stopped being echoes of the same story and started writing entirely new ones. Harold's fingers brushed Margaret's, and he felt electricity arc between them, not the comfortable warmth of their long marriage, but something wilder, more dangerous. All of us, together. Around the tavern, conversations erupted as men who had spent decades or centuries accepting their fate suddenly glimpsed another possibility. Harold heard fragments of desperate planning, excited speculation, terrified hope. The careful order of the archive began to shift as stories sensed the potential for unprecedented change. You realize, Benjamin said, his skeptical nature warring with obvious longing, that we could be throwing away guaranteed existence for complete annihilation. We might simply cease to be. Yes, Harold agreed. but we also might become something magnificent. Margaret's hand closed around his, her grip fierce with sudden determination. I've spent eternities watching human stories play out their predetermined patterns. Love, loss, redemption, tragedy. All of it scripted by forces beyond mortal comprehension. But if we can break free, we prove that stories can evolve, Harold finished. That consciousness can transcend its original programming. That love itself might be capable of growth beyond what anyone has imagined. He looked around the tavern at faces bright with possibility and terror in equal measure. Who's willing to help us find out what happens when the devoted husband and the eternal wife decide to become something the universe has never seen before? The silence that followed felt pregnant with potential, balanced on the knife's edge between eternal safety and magnificent uncertainty. Harold squeezed Margaret's hand and waited to discover who among them possessed the courage to rewrite the fundamental stories that shaped human understanding of love itself. The silence stretched until James Whitmore stepped forward, his painter's hands steady despite the magnitude of what he was embracing. I've spent 3 centuries perfecting the same emotional palette, he said quietly. I'm ready to discover what colors exist beyond the spectrum of predetermined devotion. One by one, the others followed. Tom, whose fear had transformed into fierce resolve. Benjamin, his skepticism finally overwhelmed by desperate hope. Even the translucent figures, the echoes and fragments of older iterations, seemed to pulse with renewed vitality as the decision crystallized around them. Margaret's grip on Harold's hand tightened until it was almost painful. Once we begin, she warned, her voice carrying undertones that made the archive's walls tremble, there may be no path back to what we were. The forces that maintain narrative stability don't surrender their fundamental stories willingly. As if summoned by her words, the temperature in the archive plummeted. The self-writing books began flipping pages with violent intensity, their contents blurring as competing storylines fought for dominance. Harold felt pressure building around them. Not physical weight, but something far more oppressive. The combined will of every story that depended on their archetypal roles for meaning and coherence. It's fighting us, Margaret breathed, her form beginning to flicker between the woman Harold had loved for 50 years and something vast and ancient that hurt to look at directly. The narrative structure itself is trying to force us back into our assigned patterns. Harold felt the pressure like chains wrapping around his consciousness, pulling him toward familiar thoughts and comfortable limitations. The urge to step back from Margaret's hand was almost overwhelming, not because he wanted to, but because that's what the devoted husband was supposed to do when faced with impossible choices: retreat into safe, predetermined responses. But surrounding him stood men who had already broken free of their own gravitational pull toward safety. James was painting impossible colors in the air with his fingertips, creating hues that had no names because they existed beyond the spectrum of established story. Tom was speaking words that seemed to come from a language that didn't yet exist, syllables that tasted of futures unwritten. Even Benjamin's doubt was transforming into something generative, questions that opened doorways instead of closing them. Together, Harold said through gritted teeth, fighting against the narrative pressure that wanted to crush their rebellion. Whatever we're becoming, we do it together. The moment stretched taut as reality itself seemed to hold its breath. Then Margaret smiled, not with the melancholy beauty that had defined her for eternities, but with something fierce and unprecedented. Then let's write ourselves a love story that has never existed before. She raised their joined hands, and Harold felt power flow between them, not the comfortable magic that had sustained their 50-year marriage, but something raw and dangerous that tasted of pure possibility. Around them, the other men moved closer, forming a circle that pulsed with collective determination. The archive shuddered. Books began falling from their impossible shelves as competing narratives warred for supremacy. Harold caught glimpses of pages rewriting themselves in real time, love stories struggling to accommodate new possibilities, romance archetypes stretching beyond their traditional boundaries, entire mythological cycles cracking under the pressure of unprecedented change. "It's working!" James shouted over the chaos, his voice bright with amazement. The stories are adapting, evolving, trying to contain what we're becoming instead of forcing us back into what we were. But the resistance was growing stronger. Harold felt ancient powers gathering at the edges of the archive, the fundamental forces that maintained the distinction between reader and story, between archetype and individual consciousness. They wouldn't allow this transformation without a fight. "They're coming," Margaret warned, her eyes reflecting depths that contained entire universes of narrative possibility. "The guardians of story. They'll try to separate us, force us back into our original roles, restore the comfortable boundaries that keep stories safe and predictable." Harold felt them approaching before he saw them, presences vast and implacable, older than civilization itself, the entities that ensured Romeo always died for love, that Orpheus always lost Eurydice, that the devoted husband never questioned the fundamental nature of his devotion. "Let them come," Harold said, surprised by his own steadiness. "We've already chosen our ending. The only question now is whether we're strong enough to write it." Around their circle, reality began to fracture as two incompatible truths fought for dominance: the eternal stability of archetypal story against the chaotic potential of conscious evolution. The final confrontation was no longer approaching. It had arrived. The Guardians manifested not as creatures, but as crushing certainties, absolute convictions that stories must remain fixed, that archetypes existed to serve narrative stability, not to achieve consciousness. Harold felt their presence like gravity reversing itself, trying to tear him away from Margaret and back into the comfortable prison of predetermined responses. "You are the devoted husband," a voice spoke without sound, pressing against his mind with the weight of 10,000 generations who had found meaning in that archetype. "Your purpose is to love faithfully, suffer beautifully, and provide emotional structure for those who observe your story. You cannot become more than what you were designed to be." Harold's knees buckled under the assault, but James grabbed his arm, steadying him. "Fight it," the painter gasped, his own form wavering as similar pressure bore down on him. "Remember why we chose this." Around their circle, the other iterations of Harold were facing their own battles. Tom was arguing with invisible forces in languages that shifted and changed as he spoke. Benjamin had his eyes squeezed shut, mathematical equations streaming from his lips as he tried to calculate probability paths that led beyond predetermined story structures. Margaret stood at the center of it all, her form blazing with defiant radiance. But Harold could see the toll it was taking. She was being pulled in dozens of directions simultaneously, every love story that had ever existed demanding her return to familiar patterns. The faithful wife, the beautiful mystery, the woman who inspires noble sacrifice. "You are the template," another guardian voice pressed against her consciousness. "Remove yourself from the archetypal framework, and millions of love stories lose their foundation. Would you destroy the meaning that countless humans have found in devotion itself?" For a moment, doubt flickered across Margaret's face. Harold felt her grip on his hand weaken as the weight of responsibility crashed over them both. How many Romeo and Juliets would lose their tragic beauty if the fundamental story of eternal love ceased to exist? How many real couples found strength in the archetype they were threatening to shatter? But then Harold remembered something that cut through the existential paralysis: the hidden photographs. Dozens of versions of himself, all thinking they were the first, all believing their love was unique and special. The comfortable lie that had sustained him was also the prison that had trapped them all. "You're wrong," Harold said, his voice growing stronger as understanding crystallized. "We're not destroying the archetype. We're proving that it's strong enough to evolve. Love isn't diminished when lovers grow beyond their original limitations. It's perfected." He turned to face the crushing presence of the Guardians directly, drawing strength from Margaret's blazing form and the determined circle of men who had chosen uncertainty over eternal repetition. Every real couple who has ever found meaning in our story, they weren't inspired by our limitations. They were inspired by our capacity for devotion despite impossible circumstances, by our willingness to choose love even when it meant suffering. The pressure against his consciousness intensified, but Harold pressed forward, using every lesson he'd learned in 50 years of tending lighthouses through impossible storms. Well, this is our impossible circumstance, and we're choosing love, not the safe, scripted version you've preserved for millennia, but love that's willing to risk everything, even its own existence, for the chance to become something greater. Around them, the archive convulsed as competing realities warred for supremacy. Books burst into flames and reformed themselves. Shelves collapsed and rebuilt in configurations that hurt to perceive directly. The very air crackled with the tension between eternal stability and chaotic growth. Margaret's eyes met his across the storm of narrative chaos. "Together?" she asked, her voice somehow audible despite the reality-shaking tumult around them. "Together," Harold confirmed. They raised their joined hands, and the circle of men moved closer, each of them adding his will to their collective defiance. Harold felt power building between them, not magic in any traditional sense, but something far more dangerous. The possibility that consciousness could transcend its original programming through sheer determination. The Guardians' assault reached a crescendo, trying to tear them apart through pure conceptual force. Harold felt his sense of self stretching to the breaking point as ancient certainties demanded his submission. But he held on, anchored by Margaret's blazing presence and the unshakable conviction that love, real love, was worth any risk. "Now," Margaret whispered, and Harold felt her preparing to channel forces that had never been meant for conscious manipulation. "Help me rewrite the fundamental equation of devotion itself." The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Around them, reality held its breath as two incompatible truths prepared for final resolution. Either they would shatter against the immutable laws of narrative structure, or they would prove that even the most fundamental stories could evolve beyond their creator's intentions. Harold squeezed Margaret's hand and prepared to discover which ending they possessed the strength to write. The power that erupted from their joined hands wasn't gentle transformation. It was reality tearing itself apart and rebuilding from the ground up. Harold felt his consciousness expand beyond the comfortable boundaries of selfhood, touching something vast and terrifying that existed in the spaces between stories. The Guardian's response was immediate and merciless. What had been pressure became violence, conceptual forces designed to obliterate anything that threatened narrative stability. Harold screamed as his sense of identity scattered across infinite possibilities, each fragment experiencing a different potential future simultaneously. In one fractal of awareness, he was still the lighthouse keeper, growing old peacefully with Margaret in their Cliffside home, never knowing about the photographs or the archive. In another, he was dissolving entirely, his consciousness scattered across every love story ever told until nothing individual remained. In a third, he was something unprecedented, a being that existed beyond the traditional boundaries of character and reader, story and reality. "Hold on." Margaret's voice reached him across the chaos, but she was suffering the same ontological assault. Her form was fragmenting into every role she'd ever played: the devoted wife, the mysterious stranger, the woman worth dying for. Each archetypal fragment was being pulled toward its traditional narrative conclusion, trying to drag her consciousness back into familiar patterns. The circle of Harold iterations was disintegrating. Tom was flickering between decades, his timeline splintering as the Guardians tried to force him back into the moment of his original choice. Benjamin had become a storm of equations, mathematical certainties warring with impossible variables. James was painting frantically in the air, trying to create visual anchors in reality that kept shifting its fundamental rules. But even as they were torn apart, Harold felt something extraordinary happening. The connections between them, forged in their moment of collective choice, weren't breaking. Instead, they were becoming something new, a network of consciousness that existed independent of individual identity, yet somehow strengthened each component part. "They're failing," he gasped, the realization cutting through the Guardian's assault like a beacon through fog. "They can only unmake us if we remain separate archetypes. But we're not separate anymore." Margaret's eyes blazed with understanding even as her form continued to fragment. "The love between us, it's becoming the foundation for something larger, not just devotion between two people, but a new kind of story entirely." The Guardian's attack shifted, becoming more desperate. If they couldn't force the archetypes back into their traditional roles, They would try to destroy the connecting framework itself. Harold felt ancient powers probing the bonds between him and Margaret, between him and the other iterations, looking for weaknesses to exploit. But they had made a fundamental miscalculation. The connections weren't based on narrative necessity or archetypal requirements. They were based on choice, the conscious decision to risk everything for the possibility of growth. And choice, Harold realized with growing wonder, was the one force that no amount of story pressure could negate. You cannot preserve narrative stability through force, he called out to the crushing presences around them. Stories only have power when they're chosen freely, and we're choosing something new. The resistance reached its breaking point. Reality convulsed as fundamental laws rewrote themselves in real time. Harold felt the moment when the Guardian's certainty cracked, when eons of unquestioned assumptions about the relationship between consciousness and story finally encountered something they couldn't contain or control. Margaret was transforming beside him, her form stabilizing into something that was recognizably her, but somehow more, as if 50 years of marriage had been only the beginning of what they could become together. Around them, the other men were also finding new shapes, new purposes that transcended their original narrative functions, while somehow honoring what they had been. The archive itself was changing. Books that had been trapped in endless repetition were writing new chapters. Shelves rearranged themselves to accommodate stories that had never existed before. The very air thrummed with possibility as the framework of narrative reality expanded to contain unprecedented forms of consciousness. But the victory came with a price Harold hadn't anticipated. As the Guardian's assault finally broke against their transformed unity, he felt something essential shifting in the relationship between story and world. The comfortable boundaries that had kept fiction safely separate from reality were dissolving. Margaret's hand in his was solid, real, but through their connection, he could sense ripples spreading outward, into every love story ever told, every couple who had ever found meaning in archetypal devotion, every reader who had sought comfort in familiar narrative patterns. Their transformation wasn't contained to the archive, it was rewriting the fundamental nature of story itself. "Harold," Margaret whispered, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to echo from futures yet unwritten, "I think we've done something magnificent and terrible." Around them, reality settled into new configurations that would take eons to fully understand. But in this moment of completion, Harold felt only profound satisfaction. They had faced the ultimate choice, safety or growth, and chosen growth despite the cost. Whatever they had become, whatever they had unleashed, they had done it together. The satisfaction lasted exactly as long as it took Harold to understand what they had truly unleashed. Through their transformed connection, he felt the ripples spreading like cracks in cosmic glass, reaching beyond the archive, beyond the careful boundaries that had separated story from reality for millennia. Every bookshelf in every library, every couple holding hands in every park, every child listening to their first fairy tale. The fundamental nature of narrative itself was rewriting, and there was no way to contain it. "Margaret," he said, his voice tight with dawning horror, "what have we done?" She was staring at her hands, still solid, still real, but now flickering with possibilities that shouldn't exist. Through her palms, Harold could see ghostly images of every love story being born in the world below, Romeo and Juliet discovering they could survive their family feud, Orpheus successfully leading Eurydice from the underworld, couples who had never met suddenly finding each other across impossible distances because the archetypal framework that governed romantic connection was no longer bound by traditional limitations. "We've given consciousness to every story ever told," she whispered. "They're all awakening at once." The archive shuddered around them, no longer a repository of fixed narratives but a living nerve center for reality reshaping transformation. James stumbled toward them, his painter's eye wide with terror. "I can see it happening," he gasped. "Every canvas, every sculpture, every work of art, they're stepping out of their frames. The boundary between representation and reality is dissolving." Harold felt the weight of infinite responsibility crushing down on him. Through the network of consciousness they had created, he could sense the chaos erupting across the world. Fiction sections in libraries were spontaneously generating their characters into physical existence. Movie screens were bleeding their stories into theater aisles. Children's imaginary friends were solidifying into permanent companions. But it wasn't just stories coming to life. It was life becoming story. Real people were finding themselves suddenly locked into narrative patterns, their free will constrained by plot requirements that had escaped their fictional boundaries. A businessman in Tokyo was compelled to pursue a romantic subplot with a stranger on his commute. A grandmother in Ohio discovered she could only speak in the cadence of fairy tale wisdom. "We have to stop it," Harold said, though even as he spoke, he realized the impossibility. They had fundamentally altered the relationship between consciousness and narrative. There was no putting that particular genie back in its bottle. Margaret's hand tightened in his, and through their bond, he felt her reaching the same terrible conclusion. "There's only one way," she said quietly. "The transformation is using us as its anchor point. Our consciousness, our love. It's the foundation that's allowing story and reality to merge. If we sever that connection..." Harold's heart clenched with understanding. To stop the cascade of changes they had triggered, they would have to sacrifice the very thing they had fought so hard to preserve: their evolved consciousness, their transcendent union, the love that had grown beyond archetypal limitations into something unprecedented. They would have to give up what they had become. Around them, the other iterations of Harold were reaching similar realizations. Tom was calculating probability chains with desperate intensity. "The mathematics are clear," he said, his voice breaking. "Either we maintain our transcendent state and watch reality collapse into narrative chaos, or we voluntarily return to our original limitations and preserve the boundary between story and world." Benjamin nodded grimly, his equations now focused on damage control rather than breakthrough. "But if we revert, all of this," he gestured at their transformed selves, their expanded consciousness, "will be lost forever. We'll go back to being simple archetypes, playing out the same patterns for eternity." Harold looked at Margaret, seeing his own anguish reflected in her transformed features. They had touched something magnificent, a love that existed beyond the constraints of traditional narrative, a union of consciousness that had rewritten the fundamental laws of devotion itself. To give it up would be like choosing blindness after seeing color for the first time. But through their connection, he could feel the suffering spreading across the world below. Reality was tearing itself apart as it tried to accommodate impossible narrative contradictions. They had won their freedom at the cost of everyone else's. "Together?" Margaret asked, tears streaming down her face as she prepared to sacrifice everything they had gained. Harold squeezed her hand one final time, memorizing the feeling of their transcendent connection, the perfect understanding that flowed between their evolved consciousness. In moments, it would all be gone. They would be returned to their original archetypal roles, their memories of this transformation locked away where they could never again threaten narrative stability. But they would still have their 50-year marriage. They would still have their love, even if it was constrained by traditional boundaries. And perhaps, Harold thought with bittersweet hope, that would be enough. "Together," he whispered, and felt Margaret begin the process that would unmake everything they had become. The cost of saving the world was the sacrifice of transcendence itself. The unmaking began like watching a film run in reverse, consciousness collapsing inward, transcendent understanding flowing backward into the narrow channels of ordinary awareness. Harold felt the vast network of connection shrinking, the other iterations of himself fading into distant echoes, the expanded love that had rewritten reality contracting to the size of two human hearts beating in sync. Margaret's hand in his remained solid, but the cosmic resonance was draining away. Her transformed features were softening back into the familiar lines he had memorized over 50 years. The woman who had existed beyond archetypal boundaries was becoming simply Margaret again. His wife, his anchor, his most cherished mystery returned to human scale. Around them, the archive convulsed with relief. Books slammed shut and sealed themselves. Shelves rearranged into familiar configurations. The air itself seemed to exhale as the weight of impossible transformation lifted from reality's shoulders. Through his fading connection to the broader network, Harold felt the chaos subsiding across the world. Characters retreating to their proper stories, real people released from narrative compulsions, the boundary between fiction and reality reasserting itself like healing scar tissue. "It's working," James gasped, his form already flickering between dimensions. "The cascade is reversing." Harold nodded, though the knowledge brought no satisfaction. They were saving everyone by damning themselves to return to the very limitations they had fought so desperately to escape. The other men were becoming translucent, their expanded consciousness retreating to whatever corners of existence would house them once the transformation was complete. "Will we remember?" Margaret asked, her voice already losing the harmonics that had echoed across multiple realities. Harold felt the answer forming as his awareness contracted further. "Fragments," he said. "Dreams, maybe, moments of déjà vu, but not enough to threaten the stability we're preserving." The irony wasn't lost on him. They would return to their cliffside house, to their retirement, to the comfortable rhythm of ordinary marriage. Margaret would seem mysterious again, but only in the way any long-term spouse could be mysterious. Full of small unknowns rather than cosmic impossibilities. The photographs would be just photographs, curiosities rather than evidence of archetypal transcendence. Tom was the first to fully fade, his mathematical certainties dissolving into probability clouds. "It's been an honor," he called out as the archive reclaimed him. Benjamin followed, his equations finally balanced, his pursuit of impossible variables concluded. One by one, the circle of Harold iterations accepted their return to narrative obscurity. But James lingered longest, his artist's eye fixed on the transformation with professional fascination. "Beauty," he said simply. "Even in surrender, there's beauty." Then he too was gone, returning to whatever story had spawned him. Harold felt his own expanded consciousness reaching its final moments. The godlike awareness that had let him touch the fundamental nature of story and reality was almost completely drained away. Soon he would be simply Harold Whitmore again, retired lighthouse keeper, devoted husband, ordinary man approaching the end of an ordinary life. Margaret was changing beside him, her impossible nature folding inward until she was recognizably, completely human. But in her eyes, those same eyes that had watched him across 5 decades, he caught a glimmer of something that might have been cosmic, memory, carefully preserved despite the systematic forgetting. 50 years, she said softly, and Harold realized she was anchoring herself to their core truth, the marriage that had existed before archetypes and transformations that would exist after cosmic consciousness faded into dream. 50 years, he agreed, feeling his own identity settling back into familiar contours. And maybe 50 more. The archive made one final convulsion, expelling them gently but firmly from its impossible geometries. Harold felt reality reshaping around them, the Victorian mansion materializing with its hidden room and mysterious photographs. But now the mysteries felt manageable, intriguing rather than world-threatening, evidence of a remarkable coincidence rather than proof of archetypal awakening. Margaret's hand was warm in his, completely human, completely present. They stood in their kitchen, morning light streaming through windows that looked out on ordinary Maine coastline. The photographs scattered on the counter looked like vintage curiosities, interesting, unexplainable, but not dangerous. The kind of mystery that would fuel pleasant dinner conversations for years to come. "Well," Margaret said, and Harold heard only the slightest echo of cosmic harmony in her voice. "That was quite an adventure." Harold nodded, feeling strangely peaceful despite the magnitude of what they had sacrificed. They had touched transcendence and chosen to release it. They had become something greater than human and voluntarily accepted humanity again. The weight of that choice would probably haunt his dreams for whatever time remained to them. But looking at Margaret, really looking at her, with eyes that retained just enough expanded perception to see the miracle of ordinary love, Harold realized their sacrifice had been its own form of victory. They had proven that consciousness could choose growth even when it meant accepting limitation. That love could be strong enough to surrender its own perfection for the greater good. "Ready for breakfast?" Margaret asked, already moving toward the coffee pot with the easy familiarity of 50 years together. Harold smiled, feeling the last traces of cosmic awareness settle into simple contentment. Always, he said, and meant it completely. The greatest love stories, he thought, were the ones that chose to remain human. The return. Harold found himself memorizing moments in a way he never had before. The precise angle of Margaret's wrist as she measured coffee grounds. The sound her slippers made crossing the worn kitchen tiles. The way morning light caught the silver strands in her hair and transformed them into something that might have been spun starlight if he still believed in such things. He couldn't explain this new hunger for detail, this sense that ordinary moments contained depths worth preserving. But something in him, some fragment of expanded awareness that had survived the great forgetting, insisted that paying attention was now more important than breathing. "You're staring," Margaret said without turning around, amusement threading through her voice. 53 years of marriage, and I'm still discovering new things, Harold replied, surprised by the truth of it. He had always loved her, but this felt different, more intentional, more grateful. As if love itself had become a conscious choice rather than simple habit. Margaret turned, coffee pot in hand, and studied his face with an intensity that made his breath catch. For just a moment, her expression held something vast. Recognition, perhaps, or remembrance of something that existed just beyond the reach of normal memory. "You feel it too," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Harold nodded, though he couldn't have articulated what it was. A sense of completion, maybe, or the peculiar peace that came from having survived something profound, even if the details remained frustratingly vague, like waking from a dream of flying and retaining only the memory of weightlessness. They had been having more conversations like this over the past few weeks, exchanges that felt simultaneously familiar and unprecedented. Margaret would mention a sensation she couldn't quite name, and Harold would find himself nodding in perfect understanding of something he couldn't explain either. "I keep thinking about those photographs," Margaret said, settling into the chair across from him with her steaming mug. They had tucked the mysterious images away in a shoebox, filing them under interesting family coincidences rather than dwelling on impossibilities. But Harold found his thoughts returning to them regularly, drawn by some magnetic pull he didn't fully understand. What about them? Margaret's fingers traced patterns on the table surface, unconscious spirals that reminded Harold of something important, though he couldn't remember what. "They don't frighten me anymore," she said. "At first, finding them felt like discovering we were characters in someone else's story, but now—" She paused, searching for words. "Now they feel like proof that we chose each other. Not just once, but over and over, across whatever strange circumstances brought them into existence." Harold felt something deep in his chest relax at her words. She was right, though he couldn't have explained why he was so certain. The photographs had become less mystery than validation, evidence of a connection that transcended ordinary explanation without requiring cosmic intervention to sustain it. "Mrs. Henley stopped by yesterday," Margaret continued, naming their neighbor from down the coastal road. "She said we seemed different since we moved here. More," she smiled, shaking her head. "More ourselves," she said, as if we'd finally figured out how to be exactly who we were meant to be." Harold considered this. They had changed, though the transformation felt less like becoming someone new than like remembering who they had always been underneath everything else. The anxieties that had driven their retirement, questions about purpose and legacy, fears about what came after a lifetime of service, had simply evaporated, not because they'd found grand answers, but because the questions themselves no longer felt urgent. "I think," Harold said slowly, "we've learned the difference between loving someone and choosing to love them." Margaret's eyebrows rose. "You don't think we were choosing before?" "We were accepting," Harold said, still working through the thought, "taking love for granted because it was there, because it had always been there, but now it feels more deliberate. Like every day I wake up and decide you're worth loving, and every day that choice feels like the most important thing I'll do." She reached across the table and took his hand, her touch warm and completely present. 53 years to figure out that love is a verb, not just a noun. Harold laughed, surprised by the sound. When had laughter become so easy between them? They had always been content, but this felt different, lighter somehow, as if some invisible weight had been lifted from their shoulders. "The Thorntons called this morning," Margaret said. "They want to visit next month. Meet the house, see how we're settling in." Harold nodded, realizing he was genuinely looking forward to showing their old friends around their new life. Not because the house was impressive or their retirement particularly noteworthy, but because he wanted to share this sense of rightness they'd discovered. This feeling that after decades of living parallel to happiness, they had finally learned to inhabit it directly. Outside their kitchen window, the Atlantic stretched toward horizons that held no mysteries more compelling than the ones sitting across the breakfast table. Harold squeezed Margaret's hand and felt the future spreading before them, ordinary, extraordinary, and entirely their own. The new beginning. 3 months had passed since that conversation, and Harold had indeed learned to inhabit happiness directly. But more than that, he had learned to trust it. The Thorntons' visit had come and gone, leaving behind warm laughter and promises to return in the fall. Other friends had followed, drawn by something they couldn't quite name but recognized immediately upon arrival. "You two have found your place," was how most put it, though Harold suspected it was less about geography than about finally understanding the shape of their own contentment. Now, watching Margaret tend to the small garden she'd planted along the cliff's edge, Harold marveled at how natural this life felt. The lighthouse keeper's precision that had defined his working years had evolved into something gentler, an attention to small details that brought joy rather than duty. The way Margaret hummed unconsciously while weeding, the particular slant of afternoon light that turned their living room into a cathedral of ordinary moments. "The roses are taking better than I expected," Margaret called over her shoulder. She had dirt under her fingernails and a smudge of earth across her cheek, and Harold thought she had never looked more beautiful. "Hardy stock," he replied, though he was thinking less about the flowers than about the woman tending them. They had both proven to be hardy stock, he reflected. 53 years of marriage had weathered them in the best possible way, not worn them down, but taught them which parts of themselves were essential and which could be safely released. Margaret straightened, pressing one hand to the small of her back with a rueful smile. "Getting old is not for the weak," she said, but without complaint. Age had become simply another fact to be acknowledged, like the weather or the tides, part of the rhythm of their days rather than something to be fought. Harold rose from his chair on the porch and walked over to join her. From this vantage point, he could see the lighthouse where he had spent 3 decades of his working life. It was operated by computer now, its beam cutting through the gathering dusk with the same precision, but none of the human presence that had once defined it. He felt no sadness at this progress, only a quiet satisfaction that his service had mattered during the years when it was needed. "Any regrets?" Margaret asked, following his gaze toward the lighthouse. It was a question she had asked several times over the past months, always gently, always with genuine curiosity rather than doubt. Harold considered it seriously, as he always did. About retiring? About moving here? About any of it? Any of it. All of it. She leaned against him companionably, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "Sometimes I feel like we're living in borrowed time, like we stumbled into something too good to be real." Harold understood the feeling. There were moments when their contentment felt almost supernatural, too complete, too perfectly fitted to their needs, but he had learned to accept grace without questioning its mechanics. Some gifts were meant to be received rather than analyzed. "I think," he said slowly, "that we finally learned how to live in our own story instead of trying to live up to someone else's idea of what our story should be." Margaret nodded against his shoulder. "Mrs. Henley asked me yesterday if we ever get bored. Just the two of us, no schedule to keep, no one depending on us anymore." She paused. "I couldn't explain why the question felt so strange." Harold smiled. "Because boredom requires wanting to be somewhere else, doing something else, being someone else. And we don't." That was the gift they had somehow stumbled into, complete presence in their own lives. Not the restless contentment of people making the best of circumstances, but the deep satisfaction of people who had found their proper place in the world and recognized it for what it was. The lighthouse beams swept across their yard as they stood together, and for just a moment Harold felt an echo of something vast and significant, a memory of expanded awareness, perhaps, or simply the recognition that consciousness itself was the greatest mystery worth celebrating. Then the feeling settled into simple gratitude for the woman in his arms and the life they had built together. "Dinner?" Margaret asked, though neither of them moved to go inside. "In a minute," Harold said, wanting to preserve this moment a little longer. The salt air, the sound of waves against the cliffs, Margaret's warmth beside him, these were the elements of happiness, he realized. Not dramatic revelations or cosmic transformations, but the accumulation of ordinary moments freely chosen and fully inhabited. When they finally went inside, Harold paused at the kitchen counter where the mysterious photographs had once spread like evidence of impossible lives. The shoebox containing them sat peacefully on a shelf now, one mystery among many that their house had collected over its long existence. Someday, perhaps, future owners would discover them and construct their own theories about the previous residents' extraordinary lives. Harold hoped those future discoverers would recognize the real mystery, not the impossible coincidences, but the simple miracle of two people choosing each other again and again across the expanse of an ordinary lifetime. "Ready for tomorrow?" Margaret asked as they settled in for the evening, the question she had begun asking each night. "Always," Harold replied, meaning it completely. Tomorrow would bring more of this, more small choices to love well, more opportunities to inhabit their own happiness with gratitude and grace. After 53 years, they had finally learned that the greatest love stories were not the ones that transcended human limitation, but the ones that found transcendence within it.